on the. All right, Megan, I'll let you take over.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I don't think I know anybody on here, which is not usually true for me. And if you do know me and I don't know you, I'm really sorry. But my name is Megan Miesler and I'm the Executive Director at Lutheran Counseling Services. I would love it if really quick you would put in the chat just what is your location? Like, where are you? That would be really helpful for me and kind of maybe like guide our discussion a little bit. So just wanted to be able to pop on, and I know we're recording this for people that want to watch, and just give an overview of what we know about times of crisis. But first, I'm located in actually Winter Park, Florida, which is just north of Orlando. My home is in Oviedo. And so like we did pretty good through this storm. We never lost power because we were like right by our fire station. But over in our areas where like all of the city of Orlando is draining too. So we like our routes are changed and things like that. And there's debris and flooding and cows at a skate park. I don't know. It's kind of cool. But just like weird things that happen when you get a 200-year flood. So that's kind of been our impact over where we are. And I just wanted to spend a little time with you guys talking about things that we know happen after crisis and things like this with natural disasters and how it impacts everybody differently. I see, okay, so we're all in Florida, at least that's what I was hoping for. But really just be able to have a discussion too about like how we can be of help for you, or if you have questions of things that are going on around you, or two, how we can be of help to those who we know are really struggling in that kind of way. So for me, I think I want to start and just go through some crisis concepts that we know about. We as an organization have, it's called God's Care in Times of Crisis. It's actually a crisis training manual for school campuses of how to respond to crisis, all different types of crisis. And I do have some resources to share with you if you, like some handouts that you can give to parents and stuff for specific issues, if that would be something that's helpful for you. So we can kind of chat about that at the end as well. So I'm going to share my screen and just talk with some just kind of normal crisis concepts with you guys, just to give you more of an overview of, I don't know, how to respond in that way when we see people struggling. So again, when we talk about crisis, and I think we kind of all experience this in a different way, we have that time where we prepare, respond, and give aftercare. And so I think the most recent crisis all of us have is probably COVID to compare that to. And I was thinking about that as I was kind of looking at our crisis stuff, is that we're kind of now with the hurricane and giving aftercare, but sometimes those period of crisis can go on for so long. And then our reaction to the disaster is the initial impact. So like, you know, last week when the hurricane actually hit us, but then how we kind of like recoil. So like we're in that period right now of recoiling, like adjusting to these different things that we have to adjust to because of what we've experienced. And now how we reorganize around that. So even when we're talking about like, are we going to take that teacher work day? Are we going to do fall break? When are we going to do makeup, makeup hurricane days? It's kind of like reorganizing ourselves now that we have been through this experience. But one of the biggest things that I wanted to point out to you, and that's been so true for us in crisis response, is you definitely have direct victims of crisis, like those who have lost their home, who have been flooded out, who have some type of reaction or directly hit, indirect and hidden victims. So I would say a lot of us are probably, if we haven't like majorly lost things, and probably some of our students, at least, like I'm in the Orlando area. And so we've had students that everywhere from were evacuated by an airboat from their home that is no longer functional anymore, to those who just rode out a hurricane, always had power and electricity and have just adjusted. But what we talk about following storms is like even driving in Orlando right now, you see piles of debris everywhere, right? You see the the after effects of disaster, or you watch images on the news. And so we're kind of all those indirect or hidden victims. In our city right now too, I think they're expecting like Jessup to continue to flood in the next 2 days. So people who haven't lost their homes may still lose their homes. So there's always these different cycles that come through after storms or disasters that make kind of different levels of victims in that way. Or those like in the Panhandle maybe who didn't have experiences from this storm, but we have re-triggered all their experiences from previous storms. I had a client in my office yesterday who did great through this storm, but the whole time was in an anxiety and panic because of the trauma she experienced from a previous storm. So I think we have to think about that especially too, when we're talking about our students, about how there's different level of victims in our schools right now. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. When we talk about crisis too, this is always really important to share with you guys. Crisis reactions are normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. So everybody's always like, well, is that normal to react that way after a hurricane? I was like, well, a hurricane's not normal. So like everybody's going to respond and react differently. And I think we've seen this more out of COVID. We change and we adjust to our experiences. So that idea of going back to how things were is kind of a lost concept. People want that. We want so badly to go back to how things were, but actually we're going to move forward a different person because of the new experiences that we've had. And in a hurricane, that can look like, oh, now I know when I'm locked in my house for 3 days, I need these things, and so you just adjust a little bit differently. Healing and growth occurs in epicycles. And I think you guys know this from grief and loss, but like, it's not like you're sad, you're angry, and then you're over it. Like we cycle through what we're feeling. And we definitely see that in students and in parents. We cycle through, we can feel sad one day, okay, the next, angry the next, and we just kind of always are cycling through emotions. But also what we know so well is the way that we've coped in the past are probably going to be the ways that we cope now. So for those who've struggled with addictions or something, those coping patterns can come out pretty strongly following crisis. If you have healthy coping patterns, they can come out pretty strongly too. But those kids who struggle even like through transitions and stuff, having a couple of days off of school, having their routine messed up, they're going to struggle to cope again, readjusting back to this. And then I always love this quote when we talk about crisis is because when you take the definition in the Chinese, one characteristic of crisis is danger and the other is opportunity. I think we saw that in COVID a lot. There was opportunity for change and for growth. It feels dangerous and it's scary for sure. But we do have an opportunity to grow. So when talking about how we respond to kids, and I'm sure at your schools, it's probably kind of like all over the board. I see some of you are from preschool all the way through high school. So understanding that we really need to be patient with students as they struggle through transitions following crisis. We need to let them repeat to us things. I think so often we don't understand that kids actually sort through, make sense of things that are out of their control by talking about them repeatedly. We as adults are not usually very comfortable with that. But giving a child a space to ask us the same questions in different ways until they have kind of gotten settled with it is really important. And I see a lot of times following crisis, I should say I have 2 teenagers and a 10-year-old, and they'll ask like the weirdest stinking questions, right? And a lot of times adults will be like, oh, you don't need to know that, or that's not important. But really trying to find a way to give an answer to their question, or saying you don't know if you don't know, it is important. So responding to children in crisis is you really have to be aware of your own stuff and what's making you anxious and upset. because so often we push the kids to the side because their questions are unsettling to us. But mostly through crisis, it's so important to be honest with kids. Be observant about what they're asking you. So my 10-year-old loves animals, and she really wants to know where all the animals went, right? Following a storm, and if they're all safe. And so what does that mean? What does that represent to her? It is that need of, for one, her love for animals, but also like wanting to know what would happen to her and her dog if something like this impacted us in the same way it did down in Fort Myers. And so for me, I'm a usually very honest and transparent person. And I think now in our technology days, you need to be honest and transparent, because if I tell her, oh, all the dogs are safe, that girl's going to go Google and find out, no, mom, that is not true, and light me up about it. So being honest, answering questions when you can, but also kind of understanding what's the root there, where's that coming from? And we're going to talk a little bit about what we see in kids following crisis, but really we need to watch for the things that they do. And so I always say on this one of the biggest stories that always sits with me is following 9/11. A lot of counselors were, or Rick Armstrong, who works with us, was up at a preschool, a Lutheran preschool, after the towers fell. And the teachers were getting really upset that the kids were building towers and flying airplanes into them. And it was very upsetting to them that that's their play that they were doing. But understanding that a lot of times kids will work things out in different ages in that way, and shutting them down and not allowing them to do it can be more harmful than for the child to not have a place to express it. So we should be alert and we should monitor it, but also understand that play, the way they communicate, those are pieces that show how children are coping and are how they are working through those type of things. We often know with kids, they're going to regress in school. They're going to regress in their sleep patterns. Eating, especially like the middle school, high school age, I think it's important to watch if kids are eating, giving themselves good nutrition, and exercising following crisis. We have a chance to teach coping skills, right, in times like this. And so those are important things to look for as well. One of my bigger things, and I've been on a bunch of school campuses, and I always share this story, but I don't say what school it was, is I was on a campus one time when the SWAT team came with their guns pulled and kind of did a sweep of the campus because they felt a father had beat up his pregnant wife, and they were looking for him. And so one of the things that happened during that time, and I was on the campus at that time, is the algebra teacher had them all huddled against a wall, but continued to teach algebra. And then like the English teacher, once SWAT came through with their guns pulled, was like, all right, back in your seats, time to get back to our English class. And I was like pulling my hair out, because we have to talk about kind of the elephant in the room that happened. We can't just gloss over crisis as it occurs. We can't pretend like it didn't happen. And so we have a tool of teaching teachers and youth leaders and other educators of how to have a diffusing conversation, of how to just provide students a place to talk about what took place. I think teachers are getting better and better about this, but it is a piece of understanding, like, you got to have your own self in check, right, when having these conversations. But I have a handout for this too, if this is something that you feel like teachers could lead on your campus following any type of crisis, but we call it diffusing, where you really just introduce what's gone on, you share the facts as you know them, you allow all the kids to share their feelings, you do a little teaching about like understanding that what are common responses from kids, that if you go home tonight and you have trouble sleeping, or you're feeling anxious and you don't know why, like that's a very common reaction. And then usually a closing phase is like, how can we respond? How can we help? What could we do? Obviously closing with prayer, but I have a whole handout that outlines this process that I'd love to put in your hands to use if anything happens. When I was working at a school downtown, we had a kid run from campus, and we were trying to find her for like hours on end. And then the next day when we brought the students back in, we used this process to talk about that. So just so important to talk about the elephant in the room, to talk about what's gone on. And like my SWAT team story, it would have been so appropriate for the English teacher to say, hey, they just came in here with guns drawn and that made me really anxious. Like, let's just have a time to talk about how you felt about that and what we know about that right now. And for me, I feel like you can do that at any age. And I feel like it's really important to teach students to be able to do that. I have been jibber jabbering for a little bit. So if you have any questions or anything that you wanted to add, please throw it in the chat or just interrupt me because we are a small group. Then we talk about aftercare and understanding that it's going to look different for everybody. But here's what we normally see after crisis. And I think, again, as I was looking at this, I was thinking hurricane and I'm thinking COVID, right? So always in all of us is a fear of future disasters, right? Like, I can't tell you how many times I pulled up my phone and looked at what is brewing over there in the tropics because gonna get ready for the next one. A lot of people have trouble focusing and staying engaged in day-to-day activities. You know, when your world is kind of flipped upside down like that, coming back and like, I don't know, filling out a timesheet feels kind of blah, right? It's like these polar opposite things that are going on in life right now. Sleep disturbances, night terrors, regressive behavior. Regressive behavior, I'm sure you guys know, but like my example is always like, for those kids that were potty trained and are younger in our preschools, to see them have more and more accidents is going to be pretty appropriate at this time. Or to see a child, even like my 10-year-old, be a little grumpier and act a little bit more immature following this crisis is going to be kind of more appropriate. Even probably for this 40-year-old adult to act a little bit more immature. And then anger at God and doubts about your faith. This is a big one that comes up. And the question always is, why did God let that happen? And I know in some of our middle schools right now, that's a discussion going on in religion class. And a hard one to have, right? God was powerful to stop that. And so we just encourage faith leaders to allow those questions. Like, this is time for faith development, but understanding that anger is a part of grief and loss, and it's a normal crisis reaction. So being aware of those. Also, stress reactions. So that can look like physical symptoms in your body, especially in kids. They come out in that way. Stomach aches, headaches are things that I wouldn't write off, but know that you're probably going to have a lot more of those. And then I think this was true out of COVID, but it feels like everything we knew about this world is no longer true, right? Like, anything could happen at any time. And again, that whole piece of, we're going to heal and we're going to grow and we're going to have good days and we're going to have bad days, but it's going to come in cycles. It doesn't look like a straight line. And so when we talk about this, this is probably one of my favorite representations. I just think it's a really good image. So if you look over here where it says threat and see where you kind of begin before the disaster hits and follow it, it looks like a heartbeat for sure. But the impact is kind of low, but not your lowest of lows. And that's really important to understand during crisis, because what we see right now after this hurricane is we see this kind of like community coming together, right? And like people wanting to help, almost too many people wanting to help. And so there's this great, like, kind of even like rallying that takes place. And that happens in the first like week or so. And probably, I think we're going to see it for maybe like a month. But then when people really hit their lowest of lows is when everybody else in the world kind of returns back to normal. And you're left to really pick up the pieces and figure out how life is going to go on with this new change. And so that takes a lot of time. If you look at the bottom, that first year of getting back into your routine, finding a new place to live, cleaning out the muck out of your house, getting the tree off your roof, all of those things. And again, it's not a straight line. You go up and down as you heal. But what we always try to point out to people is there is a new beginning. And if you notice, where this point ends is higher than where it began, because we do see growth and we do see change. And we can look at New Orleans as a place that grew and changed for sure, through storms and through struggles. And so understanding this, it's the same image we use for grief and loss, that there is kind of still, and I would say still in Fort Myers and that, South Florida area, still a lower of the lows to come, right? As the rest of the world gets back to normal and they have to pick up pieces. And then reactions that we see from children. I talked about reenacting the traumatic event, attachment issues. And I think it will be really interesting because these will be kids that were born in COVID, literally, right? That would be of this age right now. And so there's all different types of pieces that go on there. They don't understand death to be permanent. So if we are dealing with death, it is something that we have to continue to remind them about, that death is permanent. And then usually they're wanting to like solve the situation like super simply because they're very linear. Elementary kids are going to be curious about death. They're going to want to know more. They're going to ask you more questions. They'll have more of the stomach aches, and like those other kind of symptoms. They'll be fearful of family members, but also they joke about death to cover up their fears. And I always think it's funny when this is on here because my husband does the same thing. We use like joking and laughing to cover up our anxiety. So normally when we see that, for us as adults, it feels really wrong in a lot of ways, but it is a piece that we know is common in our kids. And then middle schoolers, and I would put high schoolers in here too. There's anger towards death. You will see more risky behaviors, and can show more signs of depression. And again, like I talked about, the eating and sleeping. I saw Julie ask a question in the chat, so I'm going to pause real quick here. They have 3 children who lost everything. Oh, I'm really glad you talked about it at circle time. That is what we need to be doing. And so they're acting like their house was flooded and the storm was affected. But I'm wondering if I should let the kids do this anymore. Yes, you should. You should. You should. I know as an adult, it feels like, oh my gosh, they need to stop. Like, but you should let them. You could put some boundaries around it, like, hey, you can play in this area and this is where we can build houses and do that. So you could put some boundaries around it, but I wouldn't stop all the way. So I think what I'm understanding is even those houses who weren't flooded, they're reenacting that. And so I would allow it. It is again of like, please know, like, even in my city where there wasn't a ton of, like, it didn't take over the whole city, even driving by it, everything looks different. So there's still like either an indirect or a hidden victim that needs to work out the stresses that they're feeling and experiencing. Does that make sense? Okay, perfect.
Hey, Megan.
Any other questions?
I have a question. You talked about kids sometimes doing like inappropriate jokes or joking about things. What's a good response to that? Like, do you say, hey, I know you're joking, but it might be hurting other people's feelings? Do you try to get more why they're making that joke? Or do you just shut it down?
So I would encourage teachers to shut it down, not in an embarrassing way, not being, you could simply shut it down, but like, hey, we're just not going to talk about that right now. And then pull them aside later and just say, I just wanted to check in with you. Like, I know sometimes people share jokes when they're feeling upset or uncomfortable, and they'll probably still keep pushing you off because it is a defense mechanism, right? To not talk about that issue. But I think you could pull them aside and have a one-on-one conversation with them about it, about how we want to be more appropriate about it, but I'd love to talk with you about this. So I wouldn't like call it out and embarrass them, but I would shut it down.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does that make sense?
And I have one other question about the little kids and their playtime. Like if they're reenacting or if they're drawing these things in art time, is that like a concern that you want to share with parents? Or do we just know that this is how they're doing it and it's okay? Like what level of concern should we have if we see that kind of stuff?
So like, let's go back to now that I've lost myself here, let's go back to this. Okay, to this phases of disaster. Right in this first time, in these first couple of weeks, I would let it go. I would allow it to continue. If it lingers on into a month out and we're still grappling with this, if you're in an area where visually in a month you're still not seeing the effects, then I would probably call parents' attention to it. Does that make sense? So like here in Orlando, I would imagine in a month, most of the debris is going to be picked up. And if kids are still drawing and playing and expressing it, those who haven't lost their homes, then I might call it to the parents' attention. Down in Fort Myers, where we're going to have those visual effects going on for a while, I would kind of let that go unless it got to a concerning place where it became almost like an obsessive thing that they have to do it all the time.
Perfect.
Good questions, though. This is one of my favorite things to share because one, I get stuck in this my own self. And two, I see this happen a lot following crisis. So we can get to a point where we want to help so much that we are no longer helpful and we become part of the problem, right? And so we want to be giving care, but not trying to fix. And that's probably one of my bigger issues is I'm a fixer. I'd like to problem solve and I'd like this to be done and we can move on. And that's not really how this works. And a lot of times following crisis, people assume a need and like drive down to Fort Myers and bring all this stuff that nobody has anywhere to put instead of waiting to be asked, right? And we've already gotten this a lot, like as a counseling agency, people are like, oh, are you going to go to Fort Myers? I don't go down to crisis areas for at least a month until I know you have power, until I know you can eat, until you have water, right? And so it is kind of understanding that we're going to ask what the needs are, but we're not going to assume and come in to rescue because then it becomes more about me and less about the people that I'm helping. And then being able to be independent, not dependent on other people, so important. This is the other thing I think we see when helping is hurting is that instead of just letting people express what they're feeling, we try to tell them that they're wrong or fix it for them. Or my favorite thing is like over theologize them, right? And so really in this kind of like response time, it's just letting people express whatever it is they're feeling and not putting a right or wrong piece on it. And we can really be hurting instead of helpful when we're focused so much on other people that we're not taking care of ourselves. And that is really, really important. And it feels so unnatural following crisis to be focused on myself. It's easier for me to focus on other people. But what I really need to be doing is focusing on myself first. And I can be so much more helpful for the people that I want to give care to. Not a natural thing, but it's something we need to work on. Some of the caregivers seems to be about feeling guilty that we are fine and they are not, which is a completely normal response. And like I have struggled with it already following this crisis of like, I didn't lose power. I am completely fine. And I know people who have lost everything. You know, there's somebody in our school who literally lost her whole home and was carried out on an airboat, like evacuated. And so I think you are right. I think we try to fix our own pain by focusing on other people. And that's when we get in the way and become a problem. And so I challenge people like, own your stuff. like say it out loud. We did a podcast. If you don't know, we have a podcast. We released an episode yesterday, me and my coworker, and we're like, we feel so privileged and blessed, and it makes me feel absolutely yucky because I know people who have lost everything. And so sometimes it's just about owning it first and then making sure you're staying in your lane as you're trying to offer help and not making it about you. But I would agree, Wendy. And then this is my other piece. I shared this at Educators if you were in my session, but I just think we need to say it so much more. It is great to have a place where we can talk about our faith and in our school systems, but we have to remember to allow people to feel what they're going to feel. So don't try to explain it away. Don't try to give a reason for why things happen. Don't take away what they are experiencing. And I would say, especially kids who maybe didn't suffer any loss, right? Who feel anxious and tense about what's going on, don't take away those feelings from them. Like, don't try to say, oh, but it wasn't so bad for you. Allow them to experience what they're experiencing. Stay close. And this one always hits me. Remember me for a long time. Remember that image I put up, like, we're going to be rebuilding for a very long time. This story will leave the news and we won't see it all over our TVs. And that's when we need to remember for a long time, those who have lost. Don't get scared by other people's feelings. Listen to their doubt, be patient, and remind them that there's more to life. That's a hard one right away. But pointing out the blessings can be important. And then taking care of your family and home. I said this, care for your caregiver. You've got to give care to yourself first. And sometimes that looks like the most basic of things, but don't forget your basic needs. You should sleep and you should eat and you should exercise and you should meet with your Heavenly Father. Like, don't give those things up. Spend time with your family and your own home. Sometimes we see so many people going out with chainsaws and chopping up trees when they have a tree on top of their own house. And you really do need to take care of yourself first. And then give care to others, but also reach out for help when you need it. There's a lot of places offering help, and please don't minimize that you need help, but things weren't that bad for you, but you still need help. Like, we always want to be reaching out for help in that way. So just to remind you, all of you that are on here and all the staff that work for you have access to our MAP services. And that's up to 3 free sessions for you and anybody who lives in your home with us. And so I want to make sure, like, you know, that you can utilize that now in this time of crisis. So those are the things I wanted to share, but I'd love to have a discussion with you guys about other questions or things that you're seeing that I can be helpful with, or that maybe I know nothing about and I can tell you I know nothing about. Anything going on in your own sites that you want to chat about?
I just want to share that in March, we had a crisis with a staff member, and we had Megan come and talk to our teachers during one of our staff meetings, and it was fantastic. We had the whole diffusing session, and that was super helpful, and it helped all of us to process and work through that difficult time. So she is fantastic, and I would highly recommend it, if even to support your teachers. You know, in those situations, people were hearing all different things. We all had to get on the same page, and we needed that opportunity to just talk about it and have someone neutral like Megan, who wasn't part of our staff, come in and lead the discussion and lead the session. And I just wanted to thank her again. That was fantastic. So the services are there. Definitely use them.
I like that you said that, because the diffusing process can be used like for any type of thing that goes on. And so, you know, having an issue with a staff member or anything like that, and still, even in that fact sharing stage, you can be HIPAA compliant. And in that situation with you guys, we're like, here's what we know and here's what we're allowed to share. And you can share what you think, and we can tell you, you know, we can dispel rumors, which so often in some of that diffusing process is what becomes most valuable, is dispelling rumors.
So I really liked that Wendy brought up that guilt thing, because I've had so many conversations already about that. And connected to that, like maybe you're going through something else, and you're like, but compared to what's happening in Fort Myers, you know, this is nothing. And I think it's important to remember that it is still something, even though it's not that. So it's easy to brush other things aside and be like, you've got nothing to complain about. But, you know, life happens all the time.
Well, and I think it's important to say too that like, there's just more tension in Florida, right? Like we're all just kind of like, there's a weight of a storm that's come through. And so, and before that, there was the anxiety about COVID that had come through. So that's where those hidden victims come out, right? Like we've all kind of gone through this for a little while. And so understanding that being a little anxious and overwhelmed is normal. And please don't minimize the fact that you feel that way. Tell the whole world that you feel guilty. That's what I do. Maybe not the whole world.
What's the
other thoughts? Yeah.
I was just gonna say, what's the best way to get that handout from you? Can you share that with me, the diffusing handout, and then I can distribute?
Yeah, and our handout kind of gives you more like details and like the fact finding stage and the feeling stage. We usually stick to 4 feelings because, you know, teenagers, like they'll tell you, I'm like, that's not really a feeling, you know? So like really having them use feeling words is important. So yeah, it's something I can send to you, Jennifer. And then I would just encourage you guys, like if something happens on your campus, if something happens like around you in your city, like using the diffusing process is important to just like put it out there because kids are going to be internally distracted by things that are going on all around you. Like I know Fort Myers, they had a couple months ago had like a shooting close to their campus, and they used that diffusing process to kind of just talk about it with their middle schoolers so that we're not just sweeping it under the rug. And that we're not just saying, and I'll probably get in trouble for this, but like, don't worry, just pray about it and it will all be better, right? Like giving them an opportunity to express it is a better message, and praying together as prayer being part of that coping skill is important. And I like how they even did it for circle time, because I tell you, 4-year-olds, you can get a lot out of 4-year-olds.
For sure. Well, I think this is so helpful, not just for right now, but for, you could plan for crisis, everything would be different, right? But I know these are tools that are going to be useful in so many circumstances. So I really appreciate you hopping on Zoom with us and kind of running through these things. Anything else, guys? All right, then why don't I close us out in prayer today, and we'll get back to what we're doing. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we know that you are our almighty, powerful God, and that you are in control of all things, even times of crisis and times after crisis. And I thank you for people like Megan, who have so many gifts and talents and such a willingness to share with us so that we can help our students and our families, and to just be a support for them, and to ultimately reflect your love into their hearts and into the community. So bless those who are dealing with the immediate impacts of the storm, and bless all of those who are serving in our school ministries. We pray this, Jesus, in your name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, guys, thanks for hopping on today. I'll send out the recorded link, so if you want to pull some notes up later, it'll be there for you.
Thanks, Megan.
All right, have a blessed day.